This is really cool. So I decided that we need to go big or go home, Neilf. And I wanted there to be a lot of new species of the week tonight. And in fact, there were 71 species discovered in this paper. 71 species. Not one in this paper. Not even two. But 71 different animals were discovered in this paper. And here's what one of them looks like zoomed out. It is, in fact, a native bee. So it is, in fact, a bee. So 71 new species. Where were these discovered? Don't worry, Neil. These are not going to hurt you. They were in Australia. All of them are discovered in Australia. These are actually called resin pot bees. Okay? And they're unique to Australia. So, Neil, the only place that you're going to find these is Australia. And I feel like we need to take a field trip and go find these because this is really, really cool. So they construct these brood cells, right? Which is what you're seeing here, the individual units from resin.
Allegedly!
Not allegedly Smikesies! This is where I was published from! But I'm glad that you're being healthy, skeptical, Smikesies. It's excellent. So from resin, from the bark of trees, that these are being arranged from. And actually, so Neil, what was really cool was that those 71 new species, there hadn't been that many discovered prior. And what was identified, like this was a common feature of them. And it was such a common feature that they had a subgenus named after them called Astrochile was the subgenus. And they actually came up with a common name for the bees in this subgenus just called resin pot bees because Tatum, every single one of them built little housing units that look like this. No, so Pixie, these are not out to hurt you. These are not like the murder hornets. Those are in Asia, not in Australia. And this is what I thought was really cool about this was not just the fact, y'all, that there were 71 new species identified here, but it was focusing on these native pollinators. So not your common honeybees, but a lot of pollination is done by these other bee species that are very common in our backyards. That's why you have native pollinator gardens. I don't know. It was really cool that so many of them had been identified. And interesting of these is that this resin pot making ones are unique only to Australia, and they are present in every state and every territory of Australia except for Tasmania. None in Tasmania. Everywhere else they're popping up. Yep, so they discovered 71 new species of bee. Now, they're all part of that same subgenus, that resin pot bee. We're actually going to go through, Neil, like, I don't think we need to go through all 71 species, but there was a lot of imaging. There's a lot of measurements. What's the last published piece was in 1992, and that had 7 species. Like from this subgenus, there were 7 species that were named, and they were like, yep, there was no common name for them. It was just, here's these 7 species. 1992, they were discovered. Awesome. Afterwards, they named an additional 18, but the additional 18 species, they didn't actually bother publishing on. They were just like, we think it's different. What they ended up doing was they started doing field collections. Throughout many different kinds of surveys, and there's actually this company that was supporting them called Bush Blitz. Bush Blitz's mission is to find unknown plants and animals, and it actually, whenever they do funding of these kind of research, they tend to find new invertebrates and new plants, because it's like you have money set aside from this foundation to go and find something new, and the easiest new thing to find is a bug or a plant because they're small and they look similar to one another. And so actually this group, this foundation, actually partnered with the Australian government, and so they've documented a bunch of different plants around the country that were brand new, and now they actually got this very, very close look. from an entomological perspective. I know, Glued, it's absolutely wild then, Glued. So what they first did was, back to Jaded Fairy's question, they didn't go and field collect all 71 of these. So they found 40 that were hidden in museums. So Glued, remember we've looked at museum videos where they have these drawers and these drawers upon drawers of stacks, they're just samples in there, and no one looks at them, right? There's no one looking at those specimens. Why? Because there's no money for you to look at those random specimens. Instead you're just leaving them and you're like hoping one day that someone will bother taking a look. Well, they had the money, and so now someone was like, let's actually look at those. Let's look at those later drawers. And so they uncovered all these new species that were like, wow, these are brand new and different bees just from their physical appearances and how they were stored. They could actually get some DNA evidence as well for it. Now, they didn't do the whole genome sequence. They only did that little region that we sometimes talk about that is very variable, highly selective pressures with evolution. But with 70 odd species, I would not expect them to sequence the whole genome. That would be a ton of money that I can't imagine even the foundation would pay that much for it. The remaining ones, they actually went out into the wild and actually went and started catching them and found these brand new ones. Now, they're estimating, not just in this paper, but just worldwide, that a third of all bee species are unknown. So take all the bee species that you have in the world, and a third of them are not yet identified, which is kind of wild to be able to think about it. Like all these different kind of bee species that don't yet exist or like have been not identified to science. And what's really, or they might, hopefully they're not extinct. There's a developing embryo here, Sleazy, and it is I think what's going on here is that they're sealing up the casing. They're sealing up the casing here. Yes, it does. Yep. So it is reminiscent of the mason bee. Actually, Casey, in the paper, they mentioned that these are similar in idea to the mason bee, which I think is really cool. Species the untrained eye. By fact, great question. Let's go and look at them. How about? So here's the paper. I will go ahead and post that for y'all. These figures here are showing different examples and different specimens. And what I think is really cool, when they had available, they did male and female reproductive organs. If they had them available, they had the distribution map of where the animals were located, right? Of where they the paper itself is extremely observational. It's resin, Sparky. So it's resin from the tree. It's like the tree sap that they're using to build each of these little chambers. The name again, I got you, Smikesies. The Australian Journal of Taxonomy. The Australian Journal of Taxonomy, Smikes. Smikes is like, I'm on a mission. I hate this. I hate this so very much. It's very, very observational, y'all, this whole paper. All it's doing, like, we're seeing new types of images multiple times shown throughout. I still think it's really pretty. They've had a lot of data built in here. So even if it's not it's not super cutting edge in terms of the technology, they did have a little bit of sequencing that went into play. And then they had as much imaging as they could get. So here is, let's say one of the bees. They have the female only specimen here. So you have a bunch of different angles from it. And they've got the resin pod and where it was found, which is really, really cool. Oh, nice, Saphira's mama. Excellent. See, and then we just kind of go through after each one. So then this is your second set. There's your females. There's the location. And then this one actually has the males as well. Right? So it is based on what they had available to them. It wasn't chosen based on how... It wasn't that they sexed them just because of availability, but rather... Or like that, they sexed them based on availability, not because they had a preference for which kind of sex they wanted, which is what other papers will have. Hi, Wildcats, you rule. No, so Jay, these are not honeybees; these are native bees. So actually, Mr. Spites brings up an interesting point. So Jay, these native bees are, I think, beautiful. Here's a look at one. Look at those colors. So genetically, they're quite related to your honeybee, but they don't make honey. They also don't necessarily live in a hive the same way as our bees do, like in a tree or like building that structure. There are ground bees that we call them as well that live in the ground. There's others that build these resin pots. There's the mason bees, as they're also called. And they, while they don't make honey, they go drink nectar. Yep, the mud bees. Yep. They go drink nectar. And as they're drinking the nectar from flower to flower, they're moving around pollen. And what's really interesting about these is a lot of them have a very, very specific set of flowers that they pollinate. And that is the critical component of their life cycle, where if they don't have those appropriate flowers, right, then they won't end up surviving. Yes, I'll go ahead and throw these in for y'all into the Discord. So for these, the resin pot bees are found only in Australia. And they are in the paper itself. You could actually see each zone, like they mark where in Australia they found them. How does the reproductive system work? So, Jay, I can't comment on all of them, but in general, for these kinds of bees, there is still a mating flight that happens. So they have some kind of mating dance. Just as a regular honeybee would, and then the female goes off and lays her eggs at a particular location. It's very seasonal pulses as well of when this happens. You're just kind of hoping that you happen to connect with a male, mate, and then the females go and lay and they move on. There's some of the species that have some semblance of maternal care, although it's not the most common thing. Hi, Gene Tree. Welcome in. Gene Tree, how you doing today? The maternal care, I think, is really interesting, Jay, because there's some instances where the females will actually cover with their bodies the eggs as it's raining. Those are some of the ground bees. And so that is, in the most fundamental way, a type of parental care, right? Like, it's not that, she's not necessarily feeding the embryos. She's not necessarily moving them around after being laid, but she is using her body to prevent them from getting, washed away. And that could be, it's pointed at as one of the evolutionary origins of full-on care, as what you see with like your honeybee hives, which I think is a really neat like phenomena to be able to see there. Yeah. The difference